Story number 1. The Haunting of Christmas Past. I remember that Christmas of 1929 with a clarity that still sends shivers down my spine. I was only 17 then, full of youthful certainty and a heart unscarred by true horror. Back then, in Stokes County, North Carolina, life followed familiar patterns. The days were filled with the smell of pine and the distant hum of neighbors working their fields. The nights, with their hush and their promise of peace, were usually gentle, safe. But that December was different. Something dark had settled over our patch of farmland. Something I didn't understand and wouldn't until it was far too late. I worked part-time at the general store, where the gossip flowed like coffee. That's where I first heard about the Lawson family's tragedy. Before that dreadful Christmas Eve, the Lawsons were known as good, decent folk. Charlie Lawson, the father, was a respected man who tended his fields with diligence and never forgot a neighbor's name. His wife, Fanny, was quiet but kind, always with a gentle word for the local children. They had 7 children in total, ranging from a gawky teenager named Marie down to a toddler who had barely learned to walk. People said Charlie treated his family well, that he was proud of his brood. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another family carving out a life on the land. But on that Christmas Day morning, everything changed. The story reached me in bits and pieces. Screams heard at dawn, neighbors finding the farmhouse locked tight, and then the horrific revelation. Charlie Lawson had taken a shotgun and murdered his entire family, one by one, before turning the weapon on himself. The news struck the community like a lightning bolt. We weren't strangers to hardship, but mass murder on Christmas Day? It was unthinkable. I wish I could say that was all, that the horror ended with the deaths and the grim funeral that followed. But it didn't. The real terror began a few nights later, when I found myself standing outside the abandoned Lawson farmhouse. I had ventured out there on a dare, a foolish act prompted by my friends who doubted my courage. I was drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and something else I still can't name. Maybe I just wanted to understand how a loving father could commit such an atrocity. Or maybe something was calling me, whispering on the wind that night. The farmhouse stood silent and dark beneath a starless sky. The winter air was bitter cold, and my boots crunched too loudly in the snow as I approached. I remember pausing by the front door, my breath clouding in the moonlight. The door was still splintered from where neighbors had forced entry to discover the bodies. The memory of it, of what they found inside, made my stomach clench, but I pressed on, pushing the door open, stepping into the front room where the scent of death should have faded but hadn't. A musty smell clung to the air, and I could almost taste the sorrow that lingered here. I lit a small lantern I'd brought, its light trembling on the ragged wallpaper and dusty chairs. The silence was profound, pressing in on my ears until they rang. Then I heard something. A soft whisper, or maybe just a sigh of the old house settling. But it sounded like a voice, and it seemed to come from the back room, the kitchen, where Fanny had once baked bread and laughter had once echoed off the walls. I followed the sound, my heart thrumming in my throat. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if I were wading through invisible currents of dread. At the threshold to the kitchen, I raised the lantern high, and that's when I saw them, footprints in the dust on the floor. Small footprints, like a child's, moving in a circle around the kitchen table. This made no sense. No one had been in here since the lawman removed the bodies. And yet, these footprints were fresh, the dust unsettled, the lantern's flame flickered, and in that wavering light, I glimpsed a shape by the window, figure tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like old, tattered garments. For an instant, I thought it was Charlie Lawson himself, risen from the grave to stalk his old home. But the figure vanished as I stepped forward, leaving only the quiet creak of the wind against the glass. I ran then, stumbling out the front door and into the cold night, my heart pounding like a drumbeat of panic. But even as I fled, I heard something drift through the darkness, the faint sound of children's laughter, warped and hollow, following me into the fields. In the days that followed, I couldn't keep away from the gossip. People claimed they heard footsteps in the dead of night near the Lawson property. Some said they saw lights flickering in the farmhouse windows, warm glows that vanished if you dared to look too closely. Strangest of all were the stories whispered by the children at my school in hushed tones. They spoke of seeing small handprints on their desks in the morning, handprints that hadn't been there before, as if some restless spirit had wandered the halls overnight. The headmaster dismissed these reports as childish fantasy, but I knew better. It was a few weeks later that I finally lost my nerve completely. It happened just after dusk. I'd stayed late at school to help a teacher with some cleanup in the art room. The rest of the building was empty, teachers gone home, students long departed. I was making my way toward the exit when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, echoing in the corridor. They were distinct, more than one pair, like a small crowd walking in lockstep. I peered down the long, dim hallway, and at the far end, lit by a single weak bulb, I saw what I can only describe as shadows moving across the walls. There were no figures casting these shadows. The corridor was empty of flesh and blood. Yet, on the walls, shapes danced, like silhouettes of people marching silently. I recognized a child's shape, the small frame and the swing of arms. Another silhouette seemed taller, perhaps an adult. They moved together, a silent procession down the hallway, heading straight toward me. My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, but fear clamped my throat shut. As they drew closer, I realized one of the shapes was holding something, a long object, perhaps a stick or a rifle, and I knew then this was a replay, an echo of that Christmas massacre. A replay, or maybe the souls themselves, trapped in endless repetition. I backed away, step by trembling step, until my shoulder hit a locker. The metal clang startled me and broke whatever spell I was under. When I looked back at the hallway, the shapes were gone. Only the faint hum of electricity and my own ragged breathing remained. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But as the weeks passed, more students came forward with their own strange stories. Scratches etched into desks overnight. Chairs moved from one side of the room to the other. And that chilling sense that someone was always watching. The presence seemed strongest near the old classrooms on the east side of the building, closest to where the Lawson children would have attended. Had they lived in another time and place? People speculated, spinning theories about restless spirits unable to find peace. Some wondered if Charlie's guilt had stained the very soul of the school, a dark echo trapped in the halls where laughter should have reigned. I tried my best to ignore it, to focus on my studies and brush off the strange incidents as my imagination. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that every time I sat at my desk, the one facing the window overlooking the old oak tree, something was looking over my shoulder, something unseen and hungry for attention. Once, during a quiet study period, I felt a sudden chill. The room had been warm, heated by old radiators, yet I could see my breath hanging in the air. A whisper, unintelligible but urgent, tickled my ear. I spun around, but everyone else was busy with their heads in their books. No one even noticed me shiver. It was as if I was singled out, chosen to bear witness to these hauntings. By spring, the rumors had grown so persistent that the school board held a meeting. They wanted to reassure parents, to claim that nothing was amiss, that it was all teenage hysteria and ghost stories. But I knew the truth. I'd seen those shapes, heard those footsteps, felt that icy presence breathing down my neck. The board's words were hollow, their assurances meaningless against the strange phenomena unfolding in those dark corridors. Eventually, the events slowed. Summer came, the halls emptied, and I graduated, leaving behind the school and its secrets. But I can't forget. I carry the memories with me. The silent footsteps at dusk, the shadowy figures flickering on the walls, the faint laughter that sounded like children who would never grow up. I sometimes wonder if the next generation of students will feel it too, if the cycle will repeat. Will they hear those footsteps late at night, or feel that cold breath on their necks as they try to concentrate on their math homework? Will they discover mysterious scratches on their desks, Scratched messages that fade by morning? I don't know. But I do know this: what happened at that school, what I witnessed in those halls, was more than a story, more than a dream. It was a glimpse into a darkness I can't name. And it taught me something I never wanted to learn: that the dead sometimes linger, and that the horrors of the past can echo forever in the quiet moments before dawn. Story number 2. The haunting at Hinterkaifeck. People still talk about the Hinterkaifeck murders, though almost no one truly understands what happened. I first learned of them from my grandfather, who'd fled Germany just before the Second World War and settled in the American Midwest. He told the story in hushed tones, as if afraid the ghosts might follow him across the ocean. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating or simply passing on some old folktale. I never imagined I would stand on that very soil, nearly a century later, chasing shadows in the dead of winter. It was December when I arrived in Bavaria. The fields were silent under a thin blanket of snow, and the sky was an endless sheet of gray. The Hinterkaifeck farm, or what was left of it, lay far from any village, isolated, empty, and forgotten. I had come as a researcher, someone who made a living writing about unsolved mysteries. For years, the Hinterkaifeck murders had haunted me from afar. 6 people slaughtered in their farmhouse on a cold night in 1922. The killer never found. The murderers had lingered for days afterward, living in the house, eating their food, as if to mock the dead. Even now, no one knew who did it, or why. Locals rarely spoke of the murders. When I asked the old-timers in the nearby town, they'd shake their heads and mutter vague warnings. "Don't go there," they said. "The land is cursed. Some things are best left alone." But I couldn't leave it alone. Something about the story, about that family butchered on the threshold of a new year, gnawed at me. I found a small, creaking inn not far from the site. The proprietor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, seemed uneasy when I mentioned Hinterkaifeck. She'd cross herself and say, "You're chasing ghosts. Let them rest." But I didn't heed her warning. On Christmas Eve, ironically enough, I set out to visit the spot where the farmhouse once stood. I walked along a narrow trail through leafless trees and quiet fields, a flashlight in my pocket and a notebook in my hand. The earth was cold and hard under my boots. Night fell early. By the time I reached the site, the last light of day had vanished behind the distant hills. My flashlight beam swept over the remains, just the old foundation stones, some half-buried timbers, and the outline of what had been the barn. The farm had long ago been torn down, yet as I stood there, I felt the weight of history pressing in. The silence was absolute, but it was the kind of silence that feels full of listening ears, of eyes lurking just beyond your vision. I took a step forward. My foot crunched on something, old gravel. Maybe. The wind picked up suddenly, a low whisper through the bare branches, and I thought I heard footsteps that were not my own. I froze. "Hello," I called, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. No answer came, but I felt a presence. It's hard to explain, but there was a sense of being watched. The way you know someone's behind you even if you can't see them. Then I saw it. Footprints in the thin layer of snow, leading away from the spot where I stood. They were fresh, no more than a few minutes old, but I had seen no one out here. I followed them, heart pounding. They led to an old tree at the edge of the clearing, and then they just stopped. No turn, no fade, just disappeared, as if whoever made them had been lifted into the air. A rustle behind me made me spin around. For a split second, I saw a figure tall, gaunt, shadowy, standing by the old foundation stones. My flashlight flickered, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I shivered, not entirely from the cold. I retreated to the inn, my mind racing. That night, I dreamed of the murdered family. I saw their faces, not in detail, but as pale blurs, their mouths open in silent screams. In the dream, I wandered through the old farmhouse, each room colder than the last, until I found myself standing over 6 graves in the living room. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, heart thudding in my chest. The next day, I returned to the site, determined to collect more evidence, maybe find some logical explanation. I brought my camera, a tape recorder, and a thermos of coffee. The sky was just as gray, the landscape just as silent. As I set up my camera to take some photos, I noticed something carved into one of the old timbers, a series of strange marks, like someone had dragged a knife through the wood again and again. They looked like letters, but not in any alphabet I recognized. I traced my glove over them, feeling a surge of unease. Out of nowhere, a sudden gust of wind snuffed out the dim daylight, and I heard laughter, not friendly laughter, but low, bitter, mocking. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The clearing was empty, but the laughter persisted, hollow and distant. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a face at the edge of the trees. I turned my camera toward it, but by the time I focused, it was gone. All I had was the whisper of the wind and my own ragged breath. That evening, as I sat in my cramped-in room, I replayed the audio from my tape recorder. Most of it was silence, just static and wind. But at one point, there was a sound like a heavy door creaking, and then a faint voice. I listened again and again, trying to make it out. It sounded like someone murmuring in German, too muffled to understand. Then, late at night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it again. Footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, steady footsteps, and that same quiet laughter. I jumped out of bed and yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. Just a row of closed doors and a single flickering light bulb. I backed into my room and locked the door, heart hammering. The next morning, I confronted the innkeeper. I described what I'd seen and heard. She listened patiently, her face pale. "You should not have gone there," she said. "People say the killer never left that farm, that he or they, no one knows, stayed hidden in the house, living among the bodies. Now the dead cannot rest. They walk the grounds at night. They look for someone, maybe the ones who escaped, or maybe they're just trapped in their last moments." I tried to argue, to find a rational explanation, but my words sounded hollow even to me. The old woman shrugged. "This is old land," she said quietly. "Bad things sink into the soil. They don't vanish. They wait." On my final night, I resolved to stay until midnight, to face whatever it was and get some kind of answer. I made my way back to the site, the snow crunching underfoot, the sky moonless and dark. As I approached, I smelled something cooking smoke. Maybe, but who would be cooking out here? The hair on my arms stood on end. It was as if the old farmhouse was alive again, just as it had been a century ago. I could almost see the outline of the house, the faint glow of lantern light in the darkness. Hear distant murmurs as if people were inside, preparing dinner, unaware that death would soon visit them. Then I saw them, shadows flickering across the field, carrying lanterns, their faces blurred and indistinct. They moved in a slow procession, as if reenacting the final hours before the murders. My chest tightened, my throat constricted. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. A figure broke away from the group, drifting closer to me. Its face was featureless, a smear of darkness, but I sensed curiosity or malice rolling off it in waves. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me. I felt an unbearable cold wash over me, and in that moment, I heard the frantic whisper of something behind me. I turned, and the figure was gone. All of them were gone, just me and the silent field. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The camera in my hand shook. I fumbled with it, desperate to see if I'd captured anything. When I reviewed the footage later, I found nothing but static and the faint sound of my own panicked breathing. At dawn, I packed my things and left. I drove away from Hinterkaifeck, from Bavaria, from that cursed patch of land. I carried with me a sense of dread and sadness. I understood now that some mysteries were never meant to be solved, that some evils live on, not in flesh and blood, but in the spaces between time and memory. And each December, as the year winds down and the stories resurface, I recall that winter journey to the ghostly farm, and I shiver, because I know that what I saw was real. I know that the dead still wander the fields, that the killer spirit or spirits still lurk in the shadows, and I know that I was lucky to leave with my life. Now, every Christmas, I find myself thinking about them, the family butchered in 1922, the unknown killer who wore their home like a second skin, and the ghosts who refused to rest. Their laughter, their whispers, their footsteps still echo in my dreams, a haunting reminder that some doors should never be opened, and some places never revisited. Story number 3. The Haunting After Christmas. I remember the winter of 1996 in Boulder, Colorado, with an unsettling clarity. Christmas had come and gone, leaving behind a brittle stillness that settled like dust on every street and home. I was a junior detective back then, new to the job, with a heart still soft enough to ache at the sight of tragedy. When the call came in on the morning after Christmas, I knew this was not going to be just another case of petty theft or a holiday domestic dispute. No, this was something that would sink its claws into our collective memory and never let go. They called it the JonBenét Ramsey murder. A 6-year-old girl, found lifeless in the basement of her own home. A ransom note left behind. A family in shock and grief. I arrived at the Ramsey house that afternoon. The snow crunching under my boots. The sky the color of old ash. A quiet, upscale neighborhood. Wreaths hanging from front doors. Christmas lights twinkling in the fading light. Everything spoke of the holiday cheer that had filled these streets just hours before. But now, that cheer had soured into horror. The house itself felt wrong. The air inside was thick, heavy with something that wasn't just sadness. It was as if the very walls had absorbed the shock of violence. I followed the senior detectives down into the basement, where a single light bulb swung above a cold, cramped space. That's where they found her. I couldn't bring myself to look for more than a second at the broken body of the little girl who had been so full of life just days before. Her blonde hair spread across the floor. Ribbons askew, a silent Christmas doll left in a cruel tableau. I remember stepping back, trying to gather my thoughts, pressing a trembling hand against my mouth. It was more than just the sight of death, after all. A detective must face death as part of the job. There was something else. Presence, perhaps, a charge in the air, like static before a thunderstorm. My heart hammered, and I had to leave that basement, leave that stifling darkness, to breathe again. In the days that followed, the investigation became a media circus. The Ramseys themselves fell under suspicion, their every word and gesture dissected by the press. But I'm not here to talk about the official line of inquiry. I'm here to talk about what happened after the police tape was taken down, after the official logs and reports were filed away, about what I saw and felt when no one else was looking. It started small, little things that could be dismissed as an overworked mind's illusions. The first time was a few nights later, when I had stayed late at the station, going over the few leads we had. The entire office was quiet, most of the staff gone home. I stood by a window, coffee gone cold in my hand, when I heard a whisper, my name, soft, delicate, as if spoken by a child. I turned, expecting to see a colleague, but there was no one, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant hum of a fax machine. I convinced myself it was nothing. Stress, exhaustion. I hadn't been sleeping well since the murder, but that night, as I drifted off in my cramped apartment, I dreamed of a hallway lined with garland and tinsel, somewhere inside the Ramsey home. Though I'd only been in a few rooms, in the dream, I saw a small figure dart just out of sight, trailing a ribbon behind her. I woke up drenched in sweat, the name JonBenét lingering on my lips like a prayer or a curse. The second incident was more tangible. I was allowed back into the Ramsey house a week later, assigned to check a few details the detectives wanted clarified. It was late afternoon, the light outside turning gold, illuminating dust motes in the corridors. The family had moved away, of course, and the place was eerily empty, save for some leftover decorations that hadn't been taken down yet. The silence was immense. As I moved toward the stairs, I heard something from the upper floor, a giggle light, melodic, a child's laugh. My blood ran cold. I called out, demanding to know who was there. There was no response, only the hush of empty rooms. I climbed the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The second floor was dim, curtains drawn. I opened a door to what looked like a playroom. Empty, just toys and a child's bed in the corner. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse in the mirror on the opposite wall. A flicker, a shape, a girl, blonde hair, ribbons. She stood behind me, just for an instant, and her eyes, God, her eyes were filled with sorrow and something else. Something that felt like pleading. I spun around, and the room was empty, just me and the quiet. But the scent of something sweet lingered, maybe from the child's perfume or soap that had once been used in that room. I left the house on trembling legs, not caring if my superiors thought me a coward. As days turned into weeks, the stories started to spread among the staff. A custodian mentioned hearing soft footsteps in the hall outside the station's storage room late at night. An intern swore she saw a child's reflection in a window near the evidence room. None of us would say it aloud, but we all thought it. JonBenét's presence was lingering, trying to tell us something, or maybe just unable to find rest in a world that had let her down so terribly. I started to spend my nights reading old reports, trying to piece together a motive, a face, a name for the killer. The media circus had offered theories. A family member, a stranger, a disturbed neighbor. None of them seemed to fit neatly. The crime scene had told a story of confusion and cruelty, but no resolution. As I worked, I felt the eyes at my back again. I heard that gentle laughter from just outside my peripheral vision. Each time I looked, I saw nothing, but each time, my heart pounded harder. Christmas came and went without answers. Snow covered the city. The lights and carols rang hollow in the wake of what had happened. The tragedy became a kind of dark holiday tale, whispered about at gatherings. The world outside Boulder's borders watched from afar, fascinated and horrified, while we in the thick of it tried to pretend we could still find normalcy. One bitterly cold evening, I found myself back at the Ramsey home, though I can't rightly say why. I think I wanted closure. The wind rattled the windows as I stepped inside the dark interior. My flashlight beam cut across the living room floor. Everything was silent, except for my own breathing and the creaking of the old house. Then I heard it again, footsteps, but soft and light, as if made by tiny slippers on the hardwood floor. My chest tightened. I followed the sound to the basement, where the girl's body had been found. My heart thundered as I descended the stairs, memory and fear tangling in my mind. At the bottom, I paused, flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello," I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer, just the silence of death and dust. I moved forward, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her again, standing not more than a few feet away, her form outlined in a pale glow that had no source. She looked so young, so heartbreakingly fragile. Her eyes met mine, and I felt tears welling up. Unbidden, she raised a finger to her lips, as if to shush me, and then, just as before, she vanished. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, tears rolling down my cheeks, unable to understand what I had witnessed. Was it a ghost, or my own guilt and helplessness given form? In the end, I fled. I left that basement behind, the questions unanswered, the case unsolved. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't stay. I couldn't bear the weight of her spirit lingering in the corners of my mind. I needed distance, and maybe, just maybe, some semblance of peace. To this day, I can't set foot in Boulder without recalling that dreadful Christmas, that horrible, senseless killing, and the haunting presence that followed after. The world moved on, but I never did. I still see her sometimes. In my dreams, her gentle laughter echoing down empty hallways. Her eyes filled with a sadness no child should ever know. I try to tell myself she's found peace by now, but I know better. Some ghosts linger not out of malevolence, but out of pain, confusion, and the desperate need to be heard. And as long as her voice echoes in my memory, I'll never forget.